Some people will tell you to just start writing and then sort it out later. But if you don't know what you want to say, then you have no basis for choosing relevant literature or relevant details. This means that everything is potentially relevant, and the literature review will turn into a monster that will grow as it feeds off your soul. And then, if you manage to complete a draft, and that's a big if you didn't know what you wanted to say when writing, the reader then has to do the work of interpreting it. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to write a PhD literature review without using AI. In part 1, I explained why I think this is necessary, and I explained how to start building your foundational knowledge of the literature. So if you haven't seen it yet, watch part 1 first, because you need to understand the literature before you can write about it with any confidence. And as I said in part 1, if you want a process that you can just follow from start to finish without thinking or using your own judgment, it doesn't exist. But there are some general principles you can follow and adapt to your own needs. But before we get started, if we haven't met before, my name's James Hayton. I'm a recovering physicist, and since 2010, I've worked full-time coaching PhD students from all kinds of academic disciplines in academic writing and general project management skills, with the overall aim of making your PhD a more positive experience. So if you want to know more about what I do, my coaching and my membership program, check out my website at phd.academy. So back when I was writing my own thesis, I set myself 3 basic ground rules for writing about the literature. The first rule is that you do not talk about anything you haven't read and understood. My assumption was that anything I put into my thesis, I needed to be able to defend. So I stuck to the literature I knew and was comfortable talking about. The second rule was that the literature had to be good enough to get into my thesis. So instead of thinking I had to include as much as possible, I took an exclusive approach, only including the best and most relevant sources. And the more sources there were on a topic, the stricter I would be with this exclusivity. So if there were only a few sources, then I would lower the bar. But if there were thousands, then I would only take the very best. And the third rule was that if there was any doubt about whether a paper met rules 1 and 2, I would leave it out. So these rules reduced the number of references, but a literature review is not about showing how much you've read. Anybody can just add more references. But if you want to show understanding, then it's about thoughtful selection of the best and most relevant sources. These rules will also naturally limit the scope of any literature review you write, but it's usually better to have a focused review of literature you understand than to broaden it just for the sake of it. And focusing on the areas where you're strongest will also make it easier to write and defend. So one of the most common mistakes is to focus on the areas where you're weakest and to put more references in to compensate or just in case the examiner wants to see them. But all this does is attract the reader's attention and invite more difficult questions in the defense. And the final rule is that you need to have some idea of what you want to say before you start writing. Some people will tell you to just start writing and then sort it out later. But if you don't know what you want to say, then you have no basis for choosing relevant literature or relevant details. This means that everything is potentially relevant, and the literature review will turn into a monster that will grow as it feeds off your soul. And then, if you manage to complete a draft, and that's a big if you didn't know what you wanted to say when writing, the reader then has to do the work of interpreting it. Knowing what you want to say in advance gives the writing some focus and purpose, while also giving yourself a basis for making confident decisions as you write. So the fundamental question is, what do you want to say about the literature? What are the most important points you want to get across to the reader? And just like when I spoke about getting to know the literature, the answers will vary depending on the context and what you're trying to do. For example, if you're writing a research proposal, then the most important point would probably be to establish that your own research is of interest to the field and has potential to provide some new and useful insights. And we might show this by focusing on how others have approached the same or similar problems or questions, then establishing why there is a need for your research. And this need could be a gap in the literature where there's something important that hasn't been done, or it could be that many people have looked at the issue before, but there's some limitation that means there's a need to approach it in a slightly different way. So you need to be clear in your own mind before you start writing about what the gap or limitation or need is. Then you can choose appropriate literature to show the best of what's been done and how you plan to add to it. And again, I'm assuming that you know what your research is, but if you want to know how to develop a project idea, then leave a comment below and I'll cover it in another video. If you're not writing a proposal, but writing a review doing a meta-analysis of prior results, it has a different focus. So then you would need to set clear and strict criteria for inclusion and read the papers and do the meta-analysis before you write, so you know where you're going. Or maybe you want to write about the development of an idea, in which case you might want to focus on key developments in the field. Or maybe you want to detail alternative approaches to a specific problem. In this case, you might focus on the best representative examples of the different approaches that already exist. Or perhaps you want to cover different sides in an ongoing debate, in which case the focus might be on explaining the opposing arguments. So the choices you make will depend in part on what you're trying to achieve, but they will also depend on your point of view. For example, if there are many different definitions of a term, the goal should be to arrive at the definition you use for your project. If you know what definition you want to use, based on the reading and thinking you've done, you can then construct an argument that leads the reader to that conclusion. And this brings us to the next key point. If you understand structure in writing, you can make deliberate choices as you write, saving huge amounts of time compared to just writing and sorting it out later. And again, a lot of the advice on writing structure is poor, with advice like using the peer system, where you make a point or use a topic sentence, then give evidence and explanation, and then repeat the point or use a linking sentence. Now, this structure might work for some paragraphs, but there's a lot more to writing than just points and evidence. There are relationships between ideas. So not just within paragraphs, but across whole documents. And the link from one paper to the next doesn't necessarily happen between the paragraphs. It can be established through context, which we'll come to in a moment. So others may tell you that in terms of structure, you have to say everything 3 times. So you say what you're going to say it, and then say what you've just said. But far from making it easier to read, this usually makes the writing unnecessarily repetitive. You don't see that kind of repetition in journalism or good non-fiction writing because it isn't necessary. A skillful writer can make their point once and move on, only repeating points where it's useful or necessary to do so, and assuming that the reader is smart enough to go back over a section if they forget what you've said, just like you can go back over sections of this video. So let's look at an example structure that you can use and adapt to your own needs. So you can start by first making an observation about the literature, then providing examples. So let's say there is a long-running debate in the field about the causes of some phenomenon, and nobody agrees on an explanation. So a bit like the example I gave in the last video. A simple statement like there has been a long-running debate as to the causes of X with two main competing explanations. This sets the context and the focus for the paragraphs to follow. You don't need to patronize the reader by explicitly signposting that the following section will discuss the two sides, because it is clearly implied. Then, you can choose the best sources to represent each side of the debate. So if we say, the most influential early explanation was put forward by Green, then the reader knows the importance of this source before we've explained anything about what Green proposed. Now, a quick note here is that if you noticed that Green was heavily cited and influential, you should have the confidence to put forward that observation yourself. You don't need to find another source that says that Green was influential. In fact, if you say, according to Brown, the most influential early explanation was that of Green, it might give the impression that you don't have a view of your own and actually weaken your argument in the eyes of the reader. So we can present Green's view and then possibly some examples of later literature that supports it. And how much detail you go into here might depend on how important this is for your own work, or it might depend on the format because you might have limited space in a journal article. So you could summarize the evidence in a single sentence, or you could give 10 pages. But the key is that these examples serve as evidence of Green's hypothesis. So they are in support of a clear and specific point. Another quick side note here. So you don't have to give equal weight to every section of your literature review. You can cover some parts in great detail, others much more briefly. And if you decide to cover something briefly, you can then refer the reader to other sources that cover it in more detail. So the line, for a detailed review of X, see this source, can save you a lot of time if there is an area of the literature that's not crucial to your work and has been covered extensively elsewhere. Just remember that the quality of your references reflects back on you. So if you're going to recommend a source, make sure it's a good one. So this covers one side of the debate, but what about the other? Well, we need to provide a setup for the reader as we transition from one to the other. And one of the best ways to do this is to think in terms of problems and responses. So let me explain. So if Green's work had a big influence on the field, there has to be a reason why somebody else proposed an alternative. There has to be some gap or limitation or need that they were responding to. So this could be something that Green overlooked or that the theory doesn't account for, or it could be that it was based on a simplifying assumption, or it could be that new data calls it into question. So if you then say something like, despite the success of Green's theory in explaining whatever it explains, recent evidence has suggested that in these other circumstances, the theory fails to account for something else. A study by Brown. Now, without giving any detail, you probably expect that Brown's study will present evidence that undermines Green's theory in some way. Then maybe this leads to the alternative. So to account for this, Blue proposed this alternative. So this then presents Blue's work as a response to the problem or limitation with Green's work. You can then talk about the evidence that supports Blue's hypothesis and what effect Blue's work had on the field, and then the developments or debates or new questions that it led to. Now you have a choice here as to where you want to lead the reader and how much detail you give based on what you think is most important or interesting. So this kind of structure, starting with an observation of the literature, can be adapted depending on what you want to say. For example, you could present an idea and then make the observation that evidence for this is mixed. And then having made that observation, you can then present some of the evidence that supports the idea and the evidence that counters it. Then describe what kind of research is being done to settle the issue. Or you might observe that there are many contradictory definitions of a term or many different techniques for measuring something. Or you could say that until 2015, it was widely believed that, however, in recent years, something else has happened. Or it could be that there is strong evidence to support a specific point. So whatever it is you want to communicate about the literature, put the observation first, and then everything else gets easier. Now, a variation of this structure is to present a problem or question or need, and then how the literature has responded. And this works because really all academic research is a response to a problem, question, or need. And putting this first gives a reason for the literature to exist and a reason for the reader to be interested. And within the discussion of these responses, you can again use your own observations to summarize sometimes vast areas of literature. So you could state a problem and then say there are 3 main approaches to this taken in the literature. And then as you go through these approaches, it helps if you have a point of view about the relative strengths and weaknesses of the alternatives. So these kinds of structures allow you to present complex information in a way that's easy to follow because they're based on universal principles of narrative structure. And once you get this idea, you start to see the same basic stories appearing in every single academic domain. And this understanding is what allows me to help students from such a wide range of academic disciplines. So, how do you plan a literature review in this way? Well, the process I would usually advise is to start by creating an initial mind map of the literature or a specific area of the literature based on your knowledge and observations. This allows you to quickly get ideas on paper in a way that's much faster than typing, and that allows you to be as messy as you like. And for the areas you know especially well, you can include some of the key papers that you know, and you can also identify points that you need to double check, or important gaps where you may have to go back and find specific sources. Then you can prepare the bulk of your references and double check that they say what you think they say in advance, rather than typing and then coming back potentially months later to try to find sources that back up what you want to say. Then, from that initial mind map, you can plan a bullet point structure with the key points that you want to make, with your observations of the literature, and the most important sources you want to cite. But this bullet point structure can change as you write, because thinking deeply about what you want to say and how you want to express it often leads to new insights or connections, or because you might change the order of sections, or because you might decide to cut certain parts if you realize that they aren't that important. So you don't need a perfect plan before you start writing, as long as you have some idea of where you want to lead the reader and the most important points and papers, and you make deliberate decisions as you go. If you do that, you'll be ahead of the vast majority. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. But again, I know that I've skipped over some points quite quickly, and I know that much of what I've said will contradict the advice you may have heard. So if you have any doubts or questions, or if you think this approach wouldn't work for you, let me know in the comments below, and I'll do my best to help. And if you found this video useful, please do share it with someone who needs it. And finally, before you go, please do check out my website at phd.academy, where you'll find ad-free versions of my videos. You'll also find details of my one-to-one coaching and my membership program, and you can sign up for email updates so I can let you know directly when I publish new videos. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.